I'm Steve Sparks, President of the VGP, and one of the pleasant tasks of being a president of a section is that one has the choice, and in this case the personal choice of identifying the Daly lecturer. And it's a great pleasure to have Colin Wilson from the Victoria University, Wellington, deliver the Daly lecture. Colin and I share the common supervisor, and of course those who are at the VGP reception paying tribute to the life and times of Ian Carmichael will probably know that George Walker was also Ian Carmichael's supervisor. We're sort of academic brothers, as it were. Colin did his PhD at Imperial College and produced one of the sort of real classics of modern volcanology, the study of the, with George, the study of the Taupo eruption of AD 180. That still remains one of the great classics of the subject. He's got a Royal Society Fellowship. He spent some time at Cambridge and then at Bristol, and then he got a post as the Professor of Volcanology at University of Auckland, and I think about 3 or 4 years ago moved to Victoria University, Wellington. He's devoted his life to and research to physical volcanology, but with time he's not only I guess gone to all the big ones like the Bishop Tuff, the classic work with Wes Hildreth and the Yellowstone and Taupo, of course, but he's extended his interests to the petrogenesis and petrology and tectonic control on rhyolitic volcanism. I'd just like to pay one other tribute to Colin, that it's an area of science which probably doesn't get as much recognition as it should, which is reviewing journals. Colin is a wonderful reviewer of papers. He is always meticulous. He can spot bad arguments when he sees them. He goes through papers with meticulous precision, and papers always benefit from the efforts of Colin. This is a hidden contribution he's made to the volcanology community. I'm sure he's greatly improved many papers, and probably saved, despite the shock of being Wilsonated during a review, which I'm sure some people in the audience have shared with me. Probably there are a few people who've sort of been saved long-term embarrassment from his knife-sharp reviews. He has really made a big contribution there, and I'd like to pay tribute to that, and perhaps also generally tribute to those people who do peer review and take the time to do really thorough reviews. Colin is one of those people, and his contributions there, although hidden, have been, I think, immense to the subject. Colin's been a lifelong friend, and so it gives me great pleasure to welcome Colin and ask for him to deliver the Daly lecture, and also to receive a very nice certificate with my signature on it.
Well, please, journal editors, I don't want my inbox jammed by this afternoon. Thank you very much, Steve, for that possibly over-generous introduction. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming along. I can barely see you through the haze of the lights, but I assume there are people still out there not sneaking out for an early lunch. This is indeed an enormous honour and an enormous pleasure to be able to deliver this lecture to you. And part of the honour and part of the pleasure is because it's named after Reginald Daly, who spent much of his career at Harvard University. But in his short biography that's on the AGU website that Richard Hazen wrote, one sentence stands out. Reginald Daly was instrumental in recognising the importance of field geology in defining problems in the earth sciences. Now, that was over 100 years ago. The science has matured and moved on. But I would still claim that field geology, which is still the foundation of our science, still has important constraints to place on the workings of planet Earth. And what I would like to do in this talk is to give you a feel for how field geology, how lab studies can come together to build a better picture of how rhyolitic systems operate using a number of case studies, and trying to give you an impression overall of what can be done. I better start my own timer. Steve was sneaky and ran off the stage too early. So, rhyolitic volcanism. The embarrassment is that to get a really good rhyolitic eruption, you don't want one to happen. And what I mean by this is, well, I belong to the school of the cunning cowards, you see. I work on eruptions that are so large and so violent that if you are there to be able to observe the vent processes, you are very likely to be killed. And during the 20th century, for example, there have been only 3 rhyolitic eruptions. Strange as it may sound. Lots of rhyodacite, lots of andesite, lots of basalt. Only 3 eruptions. The biggest, and in many of our opinions the best, Nova Rupta in 1912, Tulaman in 1953 to 57, a little dome building event, and Chaiten towards the end of the century. We've learned a lot from them. But the challenge comes in dealing with prehistoric rhyolitic eruptions. Seismologists are lucky in one very key sense. During the lifetime of a typical seismologist, they will see a seismic event that approaches or gets certainly within a factor of 2 or 3 the size of the largest possible seismic event through natural earth processes. We'll discount meteorite impacts for this purpose. Volcanologists, though, in what has been observed in historic times, even going back to events as large as Tambora in 1815, are only looking at things that are between 1 and 2 orders of magnitude smaller than what the rock record demonstrates to us Earth is capable of. And so everything really that we understand about these systems, how they operate, has to be learned from the rock record. And for someone like me living in New Zealand, I did spend quite a bit of time doing work for an organisation where I was responsible overall for volcano monitoring. The thought had always struck me, if I knew Taupo or any of the other volcanoes we were responsible for was going to erupt, how would I know what was going on, what the timescales were, and what would I do about it, short of just simply quietly going on holiday back to the UK. And so this is a sort of underlying theme of what I want to try and show you and present to you, is the idea that we are starting to make inroads in how these systems operate. And this is a cartoon stolen from various sources. Most of you will recognize it in general. And it's simply a cartoon in order to set a scene of what I would like to talk about during this time. I will not cover the buoyant plume part of the sequence. This has been studied exceptionally well, including that person down there in the front seat. We understand a lot about eruptive plumes, their deposits, their fall deposits, their dynamics. I'm not going to cover that. I would like to use the chance to talk a bit about particularly ignimbrites, because I think they offer new challenges to understand. And then I want to take you deeper into understanding the nature of the magma chamber, again, simply using a few case studies. And a recent review, 2008, had this sentence in the introduction. And again, I don't want to make this a criticism. I'm simply using this as a template for how we might approach thinking about these eruptions and thinking about their magmatic systems. And so, first of all, one of the aspects that interests me, intrigues me, is how long do eruptions actually take? In the historic record, of course, there's no problem. You can time these things. But what about the prehistoric record? In the prehistoric record, in a country like New Zealand, with all too abundant amounts of water and vegetation, any time longer than about 50 years results in development of a soil. And so our geological record there allows us to pick up time breaks and to define individual eruptions that are spaced more than about 50 or so years apart. Even less in the case of some of the andesitic systems, which weather more rapidly. But what concerns me is if you take a given deposit like this one or like this one, can you discern how long that particular eruption took? Part of it is that we as geologists look at a landscape like this quite differently from what someone who, say, works for the local civil authorities looks at. They work on different timescales. If there is to be an emergency of some kind, whether an earthquake, tsunami, typhoon, volcanic eruption, they work on quite different timescales, and so learning to understand those timescales for volcanoes becomes really important in applying the work to actual modern-day situations. So some examples. This one, again, back to Nova Rupta. I've been very privileged to work there with Bruce Houghton, Judy Fierstein, Wes Hildreth over the years. The Valley of 10,000 Smokes Ignimbrite here, the young dome of Nova Rupta in here. It's the largest 20th century eruption, quite substantial. But the beauty is, here we do have historic accounts to constrain the timing that Wes worked through and published back in the 1980s. And the two great advantages of this eruption are that the Ignimbrite came out early on at the same time as there were wide and systematic variations in composition of the juvenile ejecta, allowing the comparison between fall and flow to be made. So the fall deposits change in composition, and at the same time, so does the Ignimbrite. And what we've done is take these, and I mean, this is field volcanology at its most glorious. You can even tell compositions in the field. You don't need XRF or electron microprobe or any, there's no sophistication about this eruption. So the proportions of the different rock types vary within the eruption and allow you to identify packages of material. Now, I don't use the term flow unit very often. The flow unit is a very valuable concept and a very easily understood concept, the product of a single pyroclastic flow event with its particular rock types. Here, we can't necessarily see the products of individual flows, so we divide them into bigger groups, group them together into what we call packages. And because the fall can be timed, then the flow can be timed. And so these different packages, from the all rhyolite flows of the first stage to the pretty much all dacite flows of number 9, can be put into a chronostratigraphy. What that then allows you to do is to take the physical structures you see in an Ignimbrite, and instead of just shaking your head, you can actually start to put times on boundaries within the flows. These same structures are present in hundreds of different deposits back into the Precambrian. You can use modern timings to infer the dynamics, the periodicity of ancient flows. So if we go back to a prehistoric example, where obviously there's no clocks as such, you can start to break these older, bigger deposits down into their components and timing. And so here's the Bishop. The advantage of the Bishop, again, is that there's a systematic zonation, in this case, of crystal content. I'm not going to go into any detail about the magma chamber or anything. It's been worked on ad nauseum by various people, including Wes and myself. But the advantage is that you have fall deposits here, you have flows embedded, and so the flow sequence can be linked into the fall sequence. You can then use the physical models for fall deposition to arrive at a first-order estimate for how long these big packages of Ignimbrite, this is probably around 50 to 100 cubic kilometers alone, were emplaced within a time scale, even though this is 770,000 years old. So you can combine the stratigraphy of the fall deposits, you can model the timing and dynamics of the fall deposits, and then apply it to understanding the timing and consequent dynamics of the flow deposits of the Ignimbrite. And in this whole sequence, the only time break we see is fine ash deposition at the top of this fall unit, F8. And here is that same horizon within the cliffs of Owens Gorge. No signs of erosion, redeposition, so we don't think that time is very long. And so this figure, which is repeated very widely, an eruption that took about 6 days. The point I want to make is that field geology is accurate but imprecise in this way. We end up with figures that are, well, days to weeks, weeks to months, not 2.567 plus or minus 0.0047 days. That's an important distinction to make. Nature is still challenging us to produce more precise figures, but in terms of accuracy, I think I can show you that we can do quite well. So the advantage in the Bishop is that by knowing the accumulation times of the big ignimbrite packages, by observing boundaries such as this flow unit boundary in here, and finding fall material along that boundary, you can work out how long that time break is to a first order. In that case, it's about 1 to 10 minutes. You can start to break these things down into their component parts. And particularly in the Bishop, accompanying the emplacement of the packages, these are hot, so the deposits are welded. The clasts were hot enough to glue themselves back together to produce a dense, coherent rock, in some cases virtually back to lava-like densities. And you can climb up this sequence, collect samples, measure the densities to get an idea of the welding. But what you can also do is then put it into a time stratigraphic framework by observing where the boundaries are between the ignimbrite units. And what that allows you to do is to realize, for example, that the thermal story hidden in ignimbrites, represented by the welding intensity as measured from density, is actually subtly different, scarily different. So, for example, the break between these two more densely welded units is actually at a horizon of no stratigraphic significance whatsoever. And the one place where you do have a time break of the order of 20 hours, plus or minus 10 hours, if you accept our chronology, there's no trace of a welding change. So it challenges us. It means that when we're dealing with ancient deposits, the story isn't quite as simple as we would necessarily like it. Another example, and one which I've wrestled with for a number of years, is the world's youngest super eruption. I'm sorry, volcanologists have to have their chest beating and ego-related phrases, and super eruption is one of them. Anything over about 450, 500 cubic kilometers of magma gets the super tag on it. And this is the youngest one on the planet. It's unusual because it's a wet eruption. There was a proto-lake there, and the magma erupted through the lake and gave rise to one of the biggest phreatomagmatic hydrovolcanic eruptions on the planet, a monstrous deposit. And it has 10 eruption phases that you can define from the fall deposits. You can work on the interbedding relationships with various laterally in place deposits, both dilute and concentrated, to produce a picture of what's going on. And the main message from this is one that still puzzles me, and I'm still working on with various students, is that when you look at the fall deposits, which represent a time clarified record, there's evidence that this huge eruption turned itself on and off several times. Now, that seems as likely as the queue dissipating for the afternoon beers at AGU, but it happens. How do you do this? How do you take 500 plus cubic kilometers of magma, ready to roll, gas saturated, and turn it on and off, like the beer tap in a pub? So we have evidence for the eruption changing its intensity so that new material's coming down while the rest of the fine ash from the previous phase is still falling. No time break at all. A sharp contact to indicate that the previous plume has dissipated before the next phase comes out. I hasten to add that these are regional in extent. This is not just a freak of this particular location. One site where there's winnowing and reworking of the top of that fine ash bed before the next one comes in. And then this basal one where it's clear that the bugs and the beasts had a chance to have a go at it before the next phase of the eruption came out. So I thought I'd put this in terms that are easier to get to grips with at a meeting like this. So here's the time break between sessions at the AGU meeting. There is no time break. There are people running to and fro. And at the extreme end, we're looking at the average review time for an Earth Science journal. So you can get a feeling that If you're there at the time, and you're, say, responsible for evacuating or not evacuating a population, recognizing these time breaks and trying to work out why they occur, how they occur, and what you do about them starts to take on some significance. And the fourth example is, finally, after a number of years, Bob Christensen lured me into having a look at the Huckleberry Ridge Tuff. He warned me before I went in the field, and I see now why he warned me. This is a very challenging deposit. It's much older, typically most of it densely welded, broken up by glaciation and faulting. And Chris's original mapping recognized three major ignimbrite bodies, Huckleberry A, B, C, with full deposits. And that work remains perfectly valid and fine. But there's a number of interesting side bits to it that have arisen. Here's the base sitting on a paleosol, full deposits, and then on top of it, just here, into the first of the ignimbrite. The ignimbrite is hot, so it's fused and darkened the overlying fall deposits. But in the basal part, you recognize that it's not just a simple layer cake fall. There's stratigraphy, there's cross-bedding. The trouble is the cross-bedding goes everywhere, and it involves only very, very fine material. It's not a surge deposit, it's not a volcanic unit, it's wind reworking. And this occurs at several horizons through the fall deposit. Now, this sort of wind reworking is not particularly widely documented. There are reasons why that might not be. But at the same horizon, 200 or 180 kilometers further south of another section at Swan Valley, here's the same horizon, cross-bedded again. These are water lane ripples. There were ponds and puddles on the surface of the fall deposit. So what time break does this represent? If you assume it's like the present day climate, and I have no idea whether this is accurate or not, then you only really get the chance for standing water once a year. So does this mean the fall deposit took a year to accumulate? When you look at the flow deposits, the ignimbrite units, especially in the area on the Teton River down by the ill-fated Teton Dam site, which I'm sure many of you have been to on field trips, one of the most noticeable things is that the basal contact to the A ignimbrite, which is vitrific, you can actually see is folded, is rheomorphically folded. John Geiselman and his group have just published a paper on the paleomagnetic orientations within this and can show this folding is syneruptive. That's fine. The snag is that when you scuffle around here, you find that the contact with the overlying B and C units is not folded, it's horizontal. There is a time break in there. So you find locations where all three ignimbrite units are preserved and cut through. Here's the top of A. It's very hard to see any obvious contact from this distance, but you can trace it laterally and find it in situ. So between this unit and this unit is a time break. How long? How long does it take to undergo that rheomorphic folding and sagging and settling and jointing of one unit before another? My guess is months to possibly a year or two, but that's a guess. Can we do better? And then between B and C, there's a change in welding, there's a change in the degree of fumarolic alteration, and clear evidence for a very long time break, humanly speaking. And we can actually get some idea of how long that time break is. So there's a welding break, but that doesn't tell you very much. But at a few locations, what you find is the top of the B ignimbrite, the basal fall units for C, overlain by fresh, glassy, non-welded base to C, but the fall deposits are, as you can see, fumarolically altered by gases coming off the underlying ignimbrite. So you can start to put some constraints on this, and so one of the constraints, again going back to the Alaska example, which is that very similar in terms of its overall thickness and emplacement temperature. Part of the reason Valley of 10,000 Smokes was named was because of the fumaroles discovered by Griggs and the expeditions, particularly in the 1917 one. These fumaroles from Terry Keith's compilation of work there died by about the mid-1930s. So you're looking at the order of 25, 30 years for 100 to 200 meters thickness of welded tuff to stop degassing vigorously. So does that give us a time break? So the Huckleberry is a fascinating thing. I'm well aware there's a poster tomorrow proposing 40,000 years between that and that. I don't think that's correct. The field geology is imprecise. I accept that. But the field geology accurately says this is one eruption from a geologist's perspective going back 2 million years or so. But if you were there at the time, you'd have all sorts of problems trying to work out when the damn thing had stopped. You can imagine here that if the fall deposits took a year, well, would you expect huge volumes of the order of 2,000 cubic kilometers of eruption to follow if it's spluttering and stopping and starting? There's a time break here. There's the next big unit. But here, years to decades. Would you have rebuilt your infrastructure? Would you have rebudgeted your, these are the questions I'm trying to answer. I'm using extreme end-member examples because they're the nicest to work on and they give the clearest picture. But this is true for all prehistoric eruptions. How do we fit them into a modern context? Because that's what really counts when we're trying to deal with the hazards and risks associated with modern volcanoes. So from a human perspective, you could consider this as 3 eruptions. From a geologist's perspective, it's 1 eruption. So now, to go from the surface into the magma chamber, there's 3 questions I'd like to draw your attention to and try and provide a little bit of answers to, if I can. One of them is, and following the petrological literature as I have done, I'm really impressed by an article of faith that underneath all these volcanoes we have this structure. I know, my name is on a paper that reproduces a diagram very similar to this, in which we have 3 entities. What we can call eruptible magma, in other words, magma that is gas-rich, has a low enough crystal content, it's melt-dominant. This is then inferred to sit within and in part be derived from what is known widely as a mush zone with a generalized barrier or some kind of barrier at around 50 to 60% crystals, so the mush is inferred to be quasi-rigid, the magma to be zoned, and the whole lot is fed and renewed by mafic recharge at various levels. Again, this model works excellently for a number of eruptions, but what I want to draw your attention to is the fact that we mustn't be straitjacketed by this model into how we perceive modern-day systems and ancient systems operating. So part of it is, do we have 1 magma chamber or 2? Here at Yellowstone, for example, at the surface, there's Mallard Creek Dome in the distance, there are 2 resurgent domes at the surface, and the geophysical work, particularly by Bob Smith at Utah and colleagues and students, have identified low velocity zones at depth that are quite rationally interpreted as melt-rich zones. But there are 2 of them. Now, is this 1 magma chamber or 2 from a petrologist's perspective of its isotopic characteristics? Is it 1 magma chamber or 2 from a volcanologist's monitoring perspective? Could you have one erupt without the other, or could you link both together? Below the Taupo volcanic zone of New Zealand, a recent compilation of deep magnetotelluric data by Wiebke Heiser and colleagues at GNS has taken a series of cross-sections. The scale is missing off this upper one, but that's about 80 kilometers long ways. So the spacing's about every 10 to 15 kilometers. And they identify these warm colors as mush zones with about 4% melt. One of them, logically, is below Okatina, the very young active center up here to the north. But their other mush zones are in here, below these 2 areas. Those 2 areas have not seen a surface eruption for 200,000 years. Yet in the geological past, we've had caldera eruptions of that size evacuate major areas. So if you incorporated those two hot zones in the middle to lower quartz-feldspathic crust, would you be dealing with one magma system or two? The point I hasten also to add is that the magnetotelluricists are very scared of this area down here because there's a big lake there. This is Taupo. Yet we know there is a big magmatic system there. This yellow ovoid here, you'll see the same shape reappear in subsequent diagrams. This is a shallow resistivity map. These are the geothermal fields up here, Wairaki, Tauhara, Takano. This is the afterglow of the Urunui magma body, recovering, coming back through. So we know there's a magma system under there now. So how do we approach and answer this question of one magma chamber or two? Well, I'll just give you a couple of examples. Here's one where the physical volcanology gives the game away. The chemistry of these two, the pumices in these two ignimbrites, is very, very similar. But grain size work, this was Darren Gravely's PhD study, and this was Dave Milner's PhD, very clearly link these two deposits to separate collapsed structures spaced about 30 kilometers apart. Yet when you go in the field, here's the younger one, the Oakuri, the older one, we're right at the fringe edge of it, is in here, and there is no significant time break in there, no more than a month. So you have these two substantial eruptions following on a sequence where the sources are spaced of the order of 30 kilometers apart. Two magma bodies. As we go back in Taupo volcanic zone history, part of our problem is it grows lots of grass, lots of soil, things get buried and destroyed. And yet, within the older history of Taupo volcanic zone, we have some really spectacular eruptions that are virtually hidden unless you go hunting for them. One of them is one called the Kidnappers eruption, around 1 million years old. The flow deposit, the ignimbrite, is possibly the most widespread one we know of on Earth, at least in the Quaternary. 380 kilometers across. There are charred logs and twigs with degassing pipes here and here. It's 7 meters thick up here, 12 meters thick here, 1.5 meters thick here. It's a staggering deposit. But it sits on top of an even bigger volume and vastly widespread fall deposit. And this again is another phreatomagmatic unit. The fall deposit is fine-grained, rich in accretional lapilli. The biggest pumice you'll ever find is about 1 to 2 centimeters long, yet it's a huge volume of magma. You've got to try and deal with this. And so how would you approach this fall deposit? Well, one approach is to simply take a best section and work your way through and use the glass chemistry. And George Cooper, a student of mine, has done this and tried to take exceptional care about the quality of the analytical work. Again, this is simply a stratigraphic log. The main point to note is that the phenocryst mineralogy here excludes biotite, and then biotite appears almost 1 meter above the base. And when you look at the chemistry of the glass shards, you start off with one group and are joined by another, and with a third one playing ragtag along in there. If you look at the major and trace element characteristics, these are not part of a single zoned body. They have parallel trends in their geochemistry. They're undergoing parallel processes, but they're not part of the same body. And the amphibole compositions, whether you use Holland and Blundy's formulation or the newer Ridolfi formulation, imply that both bodies were at the same sorts of depths in the crust. You're not left with any other choice other than this eruption came from magma bodies that were separated side by side. Multiple magma bodies. How are they linked? Why are they linked? That's part of what I want to cover a bit later. So both in physical volcanology and in geochemistry, I would simply urge that when people are working on different deposits, they don't straitjacket themselves into the idea of a single eruptive body underneath. I know it's more challenging, but It's part of the business. And then what I would like to do is move on to these two questions in turn. And in particular, what I'm concerned with is what controls whether an eruption starts or stops. Can we actually find examples of prehistoric events where we can see who's turning that tap on and off and why? And then coming back to the eruptible magma, the volume that throws itself all over the landscape as these deposits, what can we infer about their lifetime and their longevity? And I want to use the young record at Taupo to illustrate this. This is a very fussy diagram, but in essence, here is the monster eruption, over an order of magnitude bigger than anything else, in fact, all other eruptions combined. So this is the pivot point. And then prior to it, and again, this is just field volcanology, looking at layers, putting them together, trying to estimate ages. There's a sequence of eruptions which mix two kinds of magma. There's which you'll see in blue and green in subsequent diagrams. One is somewhat different, and I'll summarize it in a minute. And the other one is a magma that plausibly is an earlier tapping off what formed the major eruption. And then subsequently, we have a whole sequence of eruptions which group geochemically into these major subgroups. And again, I'll be returning to those. The one in blue, there is a last gasp, little burp of that around 16,000 years ago, and that enters into it as well. But for the most part, prior to the Uruanui event, these magma systems were active contemporaneously but are geographically separated. Subsequently, they're separated in time, the compositional variations are separated in time, but they overlap. So, just to put again in a regional context, here's the boundary of the Taupo volcanic zone. These centres have been active in about the last 60,000 years. Okataina with caldera-forming events. This is very active up here. Rotorua, Kapanga, Mara, feebly active, just small dome-building eruptions. And then Taupo down here. And what I'd like to do is show you some more detail in this area here. The main point to emphasise is that this is a rifting arc. At the latitude of Taupo, this area is moving apart of the order of 8 to 10 millimetres a year from estimates from long-term geodetic studies. So there's intense surface faulting directed right towards Lake Taupo. Virtually no faulting on the floor of the lake. It's too young, it's covered by younger stuff. And in this area, the sites for eruptions of this blue northeast dome type magma fall in this area here, and particularly for the Uruanui type magma, these are represented by domes at the surface. These are inferred from isopac and isopleth data from fall deposits. There are no surviving domes. So we can recognize these magma types both in the field. Their mineralogy is distinctly different. And in age terms, it's quite clear that the system giving rise to the monster centre underneath where Taupo is now, I hasten to add the outline of the lake is the product of the eruption, not the original lake simply modified by the eruption. The original lake would have had quite a different shape. So we have these systems venting here at 30, two older little ones at 45, particularly this one, the Tihoi, and then here at 28,000 years, an eruption from here. So they're active together. The big system did not preclude another magmatic system operating in the crust very close nearby. And what I'd like to show you is information from a locality up in here, which is very close to where I infer from isopac and isopleth data the initial vent sites for the Uruanui started up on this northeastern corner of the lake. And then the third phase of the Uruanui ripped out an elongate structure down this side of the lake. So we're just going to have a look at some data from that one deposit there. So you go there, There are the deposits, nice pumice fall, very, very fresh material. And what Aidan found was that as we sampled through this material, again, the dominant pumice type is the green Aurora Nui type, but there's a subordinate amount of blue pumice, which is biotite bearing and much more crystal rich. And there's various geochemical measures you can use. I've simply put up the amphibole chemistry as illustrative of this. So the nearby 28,000-year dome is the triangles, and then our biotite-bearing pumices are the blue squares. And what it becomes very apparently clear is that these pumices involved in the early stages of the 27,000-year eruption are identical in chemistry to that which erupted 1,000 years or so before. The grain size data, the field data, tells you that these pumices were co-vented. It's not as though we've triggered a second eruption nearby, okay? They've come out of the same vent structure. And again, when you look at the amphibole chemistry and whether you run it through Blundy-Holland formulation, Rodolphi formulation, the result is the same, that the two magma types have to have been held at pretty similar depths within the crust. So somehow we have our northeast dome type magma migrating something of the order of 10 to 15 kilometers down into the vent for the Aurora Nui eruption. There is no trace of mixing of the Aurora Nui magma with this magma in the chamber. These vertical dimensions are quite deliberate. These are based on melt inclusion entrapment pressures from the work Yang Liu did with me and Fred Anderson. These are based on amphibole pressure estimates. Those of you who are well familiar with this will know there is a plus or minus on all of this. But at all events, we're dealing with shallow lateral transport of magma into the conduit to be erupted with this mixture of compositions. And the logical thing in a tensional rifting environment is to have this through diking. No great surprise there. It's been documented. There's then that hiatus between phases 1 and 2. And there is evidence, again, in the deposits that maybe a little dome was extruded during that time break. And then you resume again into phase 2. Somebody is turning the tap on and off in the beer cellar. And the best explanation we can come up with, and there is a lovely modern example still ongoing in the AFR triangle, is this is magma-assisted rifting caught in the act. That a rifting event caused and accompanied lateral transport of magma. It can't simply be overpressure here, because otherwise, why wouldn't it vent somewhere up in here? And it can't simply be a rifting event, because we have lateral transport of magma. There is a really complex, rich interplay between magmatic and tectonic processes. And I'd urge you to read up some of the stuff from the Dabahu event that Cindy Ebinger and co-workers have been working on, because there, albeit with basalt, is exactly the timing and the processes that we envisage going on here. And another rifting event, which overlapped with 2, opening up the east side of the lake. So, where do we get our eruptible magma from? If we could go down there now with a drill rig underneath Lake Taupo, what would we see? If you could go down the day before an eruption, what would you see? What's the nature of this eruptible body and its holding chamber? At Taupo, I fully admit this may well turn out to be an end member, but I think it's an end member that will illuminate a lot of other studies, even in more conventional systems. And by conventional, I mean ones like the Bishop Tuff, where it's very reasonably well established there are gradients in crystal content and associated chemistry. Here, what we would term small to moderate, 7 cubic kilometers of magma, 35 cubic kilometers of magma. One of the startling things about the rhyolites there, both of them only have 2 to 3% crystals, and they're absolutely homogeneous and uniform in their characteristics. The Aurora Nui at 500 plus cubic kilometers does have diversity, but it was not zoned at the time of the eruption. So in our examples, there is some factor involved that means your magma bodies, whether 7, 35 or 500 cubic kilometers, are vigorously and thoroughly stirred before. A tradition is that the base of the eruptible magma, and this goes way back to Bob Smith and Bruce Marsh's work, is that you reach a certain crystal proportion and that causes locking up of the structure, and that controls where your magma finally will stop erupting. Here's an example. Here's the 3,500 year deposit, the Waimea. There's our crystal pore dominant rhyolite, which is very homogeneous. And as you go through the deposit, and this is simply a scale based on a single fall section, there's a horizon where it goes darker. It's because it contains andesite and mixed pumice. The mixed pumice is made up of a hybrid rhyodacite intermingled with white rhyolite. You deconvolute the proportions, and you can see that you've tapped through a zone here where you're suddenly getting the rhyodacite and then the basal part with the andesite erupted. Not particularly controversial, nothing unusual about this in any real way. But consider the implications. This has been written up. The andesite, we infer, erupted onto the floor of a holding body of rhyolite, mingled and homogenized to produce a hybrid rhyodacite. Again, no real startling surprise about that. And then during the course of the eruption, the drawdown and evacuation of the magma pulls up these basal materials. No surprises about that. It allows you to model the chamber and suggest that the rhyolite body itself was about 10 times as wide as it was thick. Again, no controversy. But consider the implications of having liquid crystal pore andesite. You can't have a crystal gradation below the rhyolite. How do you support this material onto something with 10 or 15 or 20% crystals? You cannot. It means the chamber has a flaw. And by chamber, I mean the thing enclosing the magma that actually erupts. So instead of having gradients, we have sharp boundaries here. So what are we looking for at a magma chamber at Taupo? If we were to look there now, would we actually see a melt-dominant body, or would we see essentially crystalline solid rocks, albeit very hot? And how long then does it take to get the melt out of that underlying zone to produce something that will go all over the landscape and cause a lot of grief to the New Zealand government? Well, many people, starting off with Mary Reid's work in the 90s particularly, have been using zircon age dating. Again, nothing of what I've been doing is new here. Zircon doesn't need any trumpeting from me as being one of the most useful minerals for trying to get age information out of rocks. There are different techniques and approaches. There's the ultra-precise end member of single crystal isotope dilution TIMS measurements. Very precise, but a lot of work, so I'm assured by those who've done it. Or you can use the ion probe, which is a lot less precise, but allows you to look at a great variety of crystals. There's surface profiling techniques that Axel Schmidt at UCLA in particular has taken as a particular way of approaching things. The alternative is to do a polished slice through your crystals, which is what we end up doing at Stanford with working with Joe Wooden. Each has its own pros and cons, so please don't take what I'm going to say as criticism of the other methods. They each give you a different picture, but what I want to show is how the way in which we approach them gives us an impression that may contrast somewhat with conventional approaches. And the main message, when I give talks, all my friends say, what's the take-home message? Because they don't want to turn up to the talk, they just want the good message so they can go off to the pub. One of the take-home messages from this is, zircon ages, regardless of the technique, they don't give magma residence times. they tell you the age of the zircon, or the zone within the zircon. And yet I've gone around posters over the last few days, and it's almost taken as an article of faith that zircon ages give you residence times. No, they don't, but I want to show you why they don't. And this is just examples. Here's some young examples using uranium-thorium disequilibrium techniques. Whole rock value, create a 2-point isochron through your data points to create a spectrum of ages that Ken Ludwig's invaluable isopop program then puts a nice probability function line through it so you can start to pull out peaks and troughs and think about them. Here's uranium lead ages from one of the Huckleberry Ridge Tuff units. No controversy. Where it starts to come unraveled, and I'm very grateful to Wendy Borson for rattling my tree vigorously a couple of months ago and reminding me of this, is that what you measure in zircons obviously requires you to grow zircons. And whether you grow zircons or not depends to a first order on the degree of zircon saturation. I don't think many people would disagree that that concept still holds true, although how it's applied might still have some degree of disagreement. So the original Harrison-Watson formulation allows you to calculate a temperature of zircon saturation for your melt composition. You can measure the temperature of eruption, again to a first order with oxides. So if your zircon saturates way above your magma temperature, then you get overwhelming growth of young crystals. Where, as in this example, your oxide temperature, the magma is still way above zircon saturation. All you ever see in the deposit, and Bruce Charlier is wincing in the audience because that was the product of, I think we got 160 grains from 45 kilos of pumice. A very informative 160 grains, I add, but they were only xenocrysts. They gave us a very wonderful and valuable picture of what country rocks were contributing. And then this unit here is roughly neutral, so you get a mixture of old and young crystals. And how you treat that data then really affects your interpretation of your age data. And I've used these terms, I think most of you will be familiar with them, but phenocryst, or Calvin Miller likes to call autocrysts, those grow in the melt in the piece of pumice that you're actually analyzing. Anticrysts, which is another Hildreth phrase that has lodged itself in the general consciousness, crystals that are still happy in that melt but are recycled from earlier periods of activity. I'll show you some examples of this. And then xenocrysts, things that are just totally foreign, have come in from somewhere else. So I want to take you back to Taupo, to the sequence. Particularly, I'm concerned with the Aurora Magma type. And here's the 30,000 year Okai unit. Notice where the vent is. Pretty much sitting on top of this hole. This is about 3.5 kilometers deep, caldera, buried underneath the lake, where the bulk of the Uranium magma chamber was that vented. And then we have these two earlier ventings of isotopically, geochemically similar magma. But the age spectra, these are equally saturated, so we've got no bias. Bruce did the TIMS work, so we know the average ages of the grains, and those tell us that these have different zircon populations, yet they came from virtually identical vent sites. And there are two ways you can interpret it. One is that, oh, this just represents a younger growth, in which case your 500 cubic kilometers takes about 18,000 years to grow. The really anarchistical one, which of course really gets people up, is that you accumulate your 500 cubic kilometer body in about 3,000 years. Now, even by modern standards, that's stoking it. That's East Rift Kilauea rates in a high silica rhyolite. This may turn out to be wrong. It may be that this magma came in laterally from a different course. It's very hard to prove or disprove that. We will do our best. But the point is that the zircon age spectra includes this old xenocrystic population and a younger population, and by looking at before, at multiple eruptions, you can then disentangle what's going on. If you just had that age population, you wouldn't be able to do this. And just towards the end. How long to remove the melt component? 6,000 years. And the idea with the mush model is the thing is buffered, it's huge, it has big volumes of interconnected melt in the crystal mush. Well, here, somehow, we either froze or drew out all the remaining melt from the Aurora by the time the younger sequence had come into activity. There is no mixing trend at all. So we have the possibility that such a large volume of melt can be accumulated in 3,000 years and lost in 6, which is quite an interesting concept. And the thing is, again, it's not down to vent sites. Here's the younger vent sites. They're sitting on top of where the old system was. So there's my favorite supervolcano at rest. One of my students is an avid trout fisherman and uses this as an excuse to go on field work when he shouldn't. Some conclusions. These are generalized ones. First, we can start to interrogate these processes on a timescale relevant to humans, and that is a really exciting prospect, to actually be able to model these systems. Models are fun, but frankly, there's nothing like the real thing. Volcanic systems move too fast for plutonic tools. Uranium-led age measurements on exposed plutons, Miocene and older, will miss all this level of detail, and it's going to be a real challenge over the next few years to see how the plutonic and the volcanic records can be melded. And the other message is, this should be a T session, not a V session, because tectonics exerts a very, very strong control on these things, whether we know it or not. Now, I'm no friend of the former Republican administration. I guess most of you in the audience aren't either, but there is one great thing that came out of that administration, which was Donald Rumsfeld's phrase. And part of the fun of working on these volcanic systems is we're right at the border of the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. It's going to be great fun to work out whether we can find any more of them. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Colin, for a wonderful lecture, sort of tour de force through field volcanology, field stratigraphy, through petrology and geochemistry to geochronology and tectonics. I'm sure there'll be some questions, so we'll probably have a few minutes for questions before breaking. So I'm going to step down there because I can't see anybody and ask for questions. If you could go up, there's a microphone there. It might be good if people who want to ask questions go up there.
Hi, Colin. Nice talk. So one of the critical things you mentioned was this distinction between the human perception and the geologist's perception of an eruption. So could you clarify that? Because I'm sure many of our colleagues have problems understanding how, if you're seeing all these time breaks up to months to years in a single eruptive sequence, how do you define that as a single eruptive event?
In geology terms, it's quite straightforward that you have to group them together. But I'm thinking, for example, of Mount St. Helens. There were multiple phases during 1980, but I think it was fairly obvious to the authorities, to the USGS guys working there, that the eruption had not ceased. It was going through quieter periods and more active periods. The 2004 event, in terms of hazards, in terms of the response, is a separate event. Yet if you go back in the geological record and look at Santiaguito or Bezzimiani, you would count it as just another lobe of the 1980 event. It's that difference. If New Zealand is like us, the US, the funders, the people who deal on the day-to-day with civil emergency, have about a 2 to 5 year half-life of memory. So what I'm concerned about is being able to establish if eruptions can stop and start on a years to decades basis, because then you've got to go through the whole cycle of warning and risk and hazard yet again. And although obviously we hope it never arises on such a scale within our lifetimes, this applies equally to small systems like Mount St. Helens, where there are big economic consequences of making a false prediction or simply not being able to deal with this variability.
Okay, any other questions? Okay.
Colin, I guess in the in a modern day setting, before an eruption, you'd expect some sort of precursory activity, seismicity and such like. I wonder what signs or record of faulting or whatever before the eruptions that you've studied might show.
The cause and effect and the timing there is very hard to establish. What we do have is evidence from 2 eruptions other than the Aurora Nui for syneruptive fault displacement going on. I'm not sure. I need to go talk to Cindy Ebinger and get a long discussion as to what the stress magma relationships are in an active rift system. I mean, Roger Buck and co have worked on this. One suspects that you actually may not see the rifting process going on until the eruption starts. Whether the in situ stress state of the crust would give the clue away that something very nasty was about to happen is an interesting point, and there just isn't any data that I'm aware of that would allow us to test that model. I'm deliberately trying to get people going away thinking, hang on, how would you know that? I'll have succeeded if I do that.
Okay, we've probably got time for one more question if there's any around. Okay, well thanks Colin. I think we'll finish there, and thank Colin for a wonderful daily lecture.